Support for Lab Out Loud is provided by NSTA, the National Science Teaching Association. Find out more about what NSTA has to offer at nsta.org. You're listening to Lab Out Loud, science for the classroom and beyond. And in today's episode, we're talking to a guest who's studying chimerism.
The basic thing is that we don't know so much about this field, and there's so much potential here. So I might have cells in me from my grandparents. Actual cells, and I don't know what they're doing. It's all started with me thinking of transmissible cancers and these cells switching all over the place.
That's up next on Lab Out Loud, but first I'm your co-host Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel. We should have said Brian Basler and Dale Bartel, because that would have been like a little piece of today's episode.
Going with the theme of this episode, I don't know. This interview broke my brain.
You were a little bit amazed by it, yeah. And we that's kind of the
How can you not be amazed by it?
Well, what I was about to say is that's part of the fun part of this podcast, is that there are times where we find topics that you and I feel like we understand a little bit more. But then when the guest comes and talks about it, you're kind of like, whoa. Yeah. And it's just, this is one of those. This is
a Scientist Out Loud episode, another one of our Scientist Out Loud series. But I would also say this is a new series of this ain't being taught in a science textbook. Surprise, there's a whole new field out there.
Yeah, exactly. And then that's it. I hope it is being taught. I hope there's something out there that, there's some cutting edge research that people are implementing into their classroom, maybe in the post-secondary level, but maybe in the secondary level. Maybe I've been out of the game too long, but it definitely doesn't feel like it's been in most of our standard biology curricula.
We didn't get into this in the episode, so I want to kind of talk about it in the intro. What are your thoughts about putting stuff like this? I would say emerging modern, I guess biology in this case. When I was doing physics, I would introduce recent headlines in physics or modern physics, stuff that wasn't in the textbook, but spend a little time on that. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think if we find some valid topics and researchers out there, I think there is a lot to be said about introducing, emerging kind of research and emerging topics that we might see a little bit more prominence in the future.
It's definitely a trade-off, because I can hear teachers saying, well, I got a full plate of, what we have to cover, and those kinds of things. How could I possibly make room for those kinds of things? But I don't think you got to spend a ton of time on it. What's great for is those weird schedule days too.
Right. And, you have to find the balance, of course, between something that's overly fantastical, and you have to be maybe prognosticating about what might be something in the future. There's been, I think about this with CRISPR, how many years ago did it feel like it was science fiction, and now it's very settled into science fact about what it is and what it can do.
I always think of my college mineralogy professor. He said that when he was in school, he remembers these guys coming with plate tectonics theories.
Oh, yeah.
And going around, and they're coming off with this, crazy idea out there, which, he was an old guy, but introducing that idea, and I thought, really? Maybe he was just making up stories for me. I don't know, but we learn more information. That's one of the best things about science. You can learn new information, and surprise, you can change your mind and you can take a new course. So
it also is something that might capture the imagination of a teacher, of a student out there listening, and decide, this is something I want to jump on board while it's still fresh in its infancy, and you can make a difference in the field from the get-go. And I think that has some real value there too.
Well, today's episode's going to do it, because something tells me if you tell your students that you got somebody else's cells in you.
Yeah, exactly. Like you said, there's like a Geraldo moment in the show that you're gonna come to.
No, Mari Povich.
Yeah.
All right, let's get started. Can you introduce our guest, Brian?
Yeah, this is Dr. Steffania Kapsetaki. she reached out to us, and this was a perfect fit for what we're talking about with our Scientist Out Loud series. So we knew we really wanted to have her on and talk about this new emerging field of chimerism.
So I'm Steffi, Dr. Steffania Kapsetaki, and I was born in Greece. I'm a pianist and a scientist. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at Arizona State University. I can tell you more about what I work on there. There's so much we do, specifically on cancer across species. I also work on something else called chimerism, which I don't think many people would know what chimerism is. So we've been seeing that lots of species have cells in them that are from different species. And that's really weird because it's like having a transplant that's essentially not your own cells. And we're thinking that those cells might be fighting our own cells, and there might be quite a bit of conflict there. And that might be like the first steps in tumors arising or even cancer. So
like a trigger almost.
Yeah, something like that. It's very early stages. Like there were some publications some years ago talking about microchimerism, which is when the baby and the mother exchange cells during pregnancy. And they found that out because there was a mother that had the son, and then after she gave birth, they found Y chromosomes in her blood, which the Y chromosome is like from male cells. Mm-hmm. So they said, well, let's check this out, and they noticed there was remnant cells from the baby essentially, and those cells they lasted in her body for about 27 years. And that's when they started looking more into this, and they saw that they even found that kind of DNA in the brain, in the breast. I said the blood, and even the thyroid. And that's when it started for me, really. When I first went to Arizona to start my research there, we thought of taking this to the next level and checking out other species like Placozoa. So they're like marine animals. They're very primitive animals. And we've been reading the literature and seen that when we put them together, they don't seem to fuse together. But other species like corals, you see 3 different species that kind of all fuse together and form one individual. And it's kind of strange because, it's strange but interesting at the same time, because at least for humans, we know that a transplant is very difficult. So we usually have to suppress the immune system so that the host accepts the donor graft. So,
is it chimerism, like chimera?
Yes, correct. Yeah, chimera. Yeah.
Wow.
So basically, all humans are chimeras, as I said, because we exchange cells during pregnancy with the mother. But they found the same phenomenon in cattle and some monkeys, I believe. So at the moment, I'm trying to categorize all these animals and see if there's a link with cancer. Because for all these animals, we also know their cancer rates, because we have lots of data from zoos at the moment. Lots of collaborators are working on this huge database of tumor prevalence, which can be both benign, so a tumor that kind of stays local, where it grows and kind of but very local. And the next stage is a malignant tumor, which metastasizes in the whole body. So for about 900 species now, we know the benign prevalence of these species and the malignant prevalence. And we're trying to link that with chimerism and see if maybe species that have lots of chimerism, maybe they might have lots of malignant tumors. Yeah.
So let me get this straight. So chimerism is the cells from like essentially the child and the mother switching, so the mother would have some of the child cells or the child would have some of the mother cells.
Correct.
Is that and that's the cells we're switching, talking about switching between mother and child, correct?
Yes, but it also includes different species. So
what?
Yeah, so that what we said is like there's different levels.
Not necessarily in pregnant women, though. In other scenarios,
No.
right?
Yeah, like if we think generally across other species as well, there's different levels of chimerism. So this one between relatives is like kind of the lowest level, as we call it. Next, we have between individuals of the same species, which is easier. Like in transplants, we often prefer like blood from relatives because it's easier for the immune system to accept it.
Sure.
And the next stage, which is not very common, even when I'm looking at other species, is between different species. So actually, I was reading that there was a lung transplant from pigs. Apparently, pig heart valves are very similar to human heart valves, and they use them for transplantation. But I believe that no pig cells are involved, so it's just the collagen and the extracellular stuff.
So would be considered a chimeric kind of an incidence there.
It's a bit tricky to classify because
they're not cells. You're saying,
yeah, it's not cells.
They're a product. It's like teeth or something. We in the Midwest we have lichens, which is a symbiotic relationship between an algae and a fungus. Would that be considered a chimera?
And now we're going into kind of deep questions of what is an individual. So, I started off studying social evolution at Oxford, and they're kind of very strong in the theoretical aspects of this. So there are lots of species that kind of form mutualisms, or I used to study algae as well. So some algae are single cells, and when you are the predator, they come together as a clump. But then when I remove the predator, they kind of break apart into single cells again. And the lichens are a similar case where they're not strictly associated with each other. So depending on the conditions, they might all join together and be codependent. But if the conditions change, they kind of still can live on their own. And
so, oh no, go ahead.
So the case here is like what we define as an individual. So I can give you like a kind of a brief definition. So the two things that we have to check. So if we look at our body, there's minimal conflict between cells. That's the one condition. And the second thing is that the cells cannot reproduce independently anymore. So like if we take a skin cell from our body and just leave it in the wild, it won't be able to make another human being. I mean, if we put it in the lab in specific conditions, we might be able to. But like in natural conditions, we're like an obligate multicellular individual. Whereas a slime mold, that kind of the cells live on their own, but then when they're hungry, they clump together. When they find food, they declump and become single cells. That's called like a facultative multicellular being. It's not a multicellular individual. So it's, no.
It's fascinating. As a biology teacher, we often talk about classification of organisms, and a lot of that comes from Linnaean classification or taxonomy. But we kind of usually think about that as like these organisms are classified, and then we move on. But what you're saying is that this is a pretty fluid kind of classification depending on environment and other interactions and even numbers of the same species that there might be. Is that a good comparison?
Yes,
there?
I mean, you mentioned species. I mean, you probably know that in many cases it's very difficult to define a species. Like for bacteria, we know that lots of genes are exchanged between different bacteria, and there's so much horizontal transfer, as we say, of genes that we're not sure what a species is anymore. And as I said, with the examples of chimerism, like I got a sheep-goat chimera, so a goat that accepts sheep cells. And how am I possibly going to build a phylogenetic tree? Am I going to put... Is it a sheep or a goat? I mean, it's like...
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm the physics teacher here, so I got... okay. A sheep and a goat.
Yeah.
Okay, so some of the goat cells are in the sheep?
Yes.
Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, but...
And those are two different animals.
Correct, yeah.
I didn't... I mean, I know about the whole, like, mule and...
well,
horse.
The horse and donkey.
That's
horse and donkey kind of thing. But this is different.
So, I mean, what I'm saying are really mostly extreme examples. So, in the most cases, we do see, like, our cells rejecting cells. But sometimes, as I said, in pregnancy, when the immune system of the mother and the baby have to be kind of weak, and in old age, we see in specific ages of our development that the immune system is more vulnerable to accept foreign things, because otherwise the mother would reject the baby, because if the baby has cells from a different human being, it has male cells. So if the immune system wasn't weak of the mother and the baby, the mother would reject the baby. So evolutionarily, there are certain stage in our development and in other species that we don't know as much. Certain stages in the development that the immune system has evolved to be a bit more vulnerable, and in those stages it's quite dangerous for foreign things to come in. And those foreign things might be bad, they might be good. Like there's lots more work to be done there. I mean, especially
how new is this field? Like, Brian, is it brought up in biology classes?
It's not in the textbooks that I've used. How's that?
No, I first learned about it 2 or 3 years ago. I didn't learn it at high school or university. It was just, it must be like 20 years old. Yeah. Although... Can
that sheep goat have more sheep goats? Sorry.
Well,
I'm going to let it go as soon as we finish the sheep goat.
So when I say that, it's like, it's not 50-50. I mean, there's like
I understand.
a minority of cells that are present. I mean,
a sheep and a splash of goat.
Yeah.
Are they tastier? No, sorry.
But,
I don't know.
No, but okay. So if that sheep has these goat cells in it, can it, like, we're studying whether it's potential to have more cancer and things like that. But otherwise, it can just go about its life and reproduce and stuff?
Yes, as far as we know, yeah. We don't really know what those cells are doing, and we don't know how many they are. We don't know if they're transferred to the next generation. They might be completely rejected after I don't know when.
So this is a whole wide world to investigate.
Yeah, I can remember now. There was an interesting, like a poster in a conference where they donated blood to. There was an American guy that needed blood, and the doctors transplanted blood from a German guy to the American guy, and then they found DNA of the German guy in the semen of the American guy. So potentially...
that's a paternity fun case there.
So potentially...
Maury Povich.
Yeah, that DNA could pass on, like... But it's one case in, I don't know, a million. But, I mean, the more people study this, the more... I mean, we might find more
You're
things.
finding that.
Yeah.
So now you've mentioned a couple ways that cells could get into another organism. Obviously, a transplant makes sense, and when we think of a mother giving birth, that makes sense too. Mm-hmm. Are there other ways that these cells can get into other organisms, or what is the path that takes place? Yeah,
so I'm currently writing this project up, and as I was reading the literature, as I said, like experimentally. There's lots of cases in the lab where people have done transfusions or transplantation in mice, like bloods between different mice or mice and rats. So that's the experimental side. Then there's the natural side, between corals, they naturally fuse. We don't know why. Some people say that by fusing, 3 different species might fuse, and in that way they might have an advantage against predation, like they're a bigger size, so maybe the predators might not be able to eat them. Other ways, those are naturally they're just. I'm trying to think whether there are any cases of if an animal was injured. I can switch now to transmissible cancers, because that's how Tasmanian devils. I don't know what.
Yes, I was about to say that. Yep.
So Tasmanian devils bite each other. I mean, they don't know why. They're thinking maybe the cells themselves, the transmissible cancers might be affecting that behavior. But essentially, during some period in their lifetime, they become very aggressive and they bite each other and they create a wound somewhat close to the mouth. And that's the way that cancers transmit around that population.
Wow. I've seen those photos. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Well, it's an
takes
epidemic
over their
there.
mouth, right?
It's really decimated their population.
Yeah, and
Brian, you teach. You're the biology teacher. Would the chimeraism? Would this be something that you would maybe not just introduce to students, high school students,
without trying to actually make this as a pun? I would try to infuse it into the curriculum in some way, shape, or form. But I think, after listening to something like this, I'd have that wow factor of and I think that as I'm kind of talking through it right now, I'm finding multiple ways to talk about some of the subjects, some of the units that we may have covered, some of the key pieces like classification, like symbiosis, like transmission of infection. And so there's lots of little places where that can pop into the curriculum there. And what I like, too, is that this conversation is triggering things that I want to know more about, which is really at the heart of our next generation science standards in the United States, of giving students an ample reason to think about a question and going to investigate it.
Huh.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a concern that it would slip into the Dr. Moreau fanciful, kind of weird town?
I think there's an element here that kind of would lend itself to science fiction, where someone might want to use this as a way to, to talk about what could happen. And as Dr. Steffi has mentioned, we kind of lean into the fanciful, the outrageous examples there. So I think you'd have to kind of talk about, first of all, you have to normalize it. I think there are times where you have to realize that there are things that are happening here. Normally, we're just learning about them, but there can be extremes, just like with a lot of other things too.
Yeah. In many cases here, I mean, we probably have to mention that there are lots of ethical concerns. I mean, to gain approval to just put cells from one species to the other is very difficult, and in many of these cases they just sort it out of accident. So it's there has to be a very good reason for research to be done in order to get approval for these things. So
it sounds like you're not doing active research at the moment, you're doing more literature research.
Yeah, correct. So
is that a lot easier during a pandemic?
Definitely. When I started, I didn't know that this was going to happen, but it turned out lucky. Yeah.
Just say it was your plan all the while. No, don't just say that. Then they think you knew.
Okay, so I know this is still in its infancy, and of course you're doing a lot of literature research right now, and you might be thinking of ways to do some physical research in the future. Do you know of any benefits, or why should we know about this? I know you mentioned the possibilities of infections with cancer, but are there other reasons that we might want to know about chimerism in this case?
Yeah, I'm thinking of, we have collaborators in Santa Barbara that are actually doing clinical work on microchimerism. And the implications, I mean, they're so broad. But the basic thing is that we don't know so much about this field, and there's so much potential here. So especially what I said about finding microchimeric cells in the brain, they're thinking that they might affect the mother and child relationship, especially early in development. So imagine, I mean, the baby has their cells in the brain of the mother, so they could potentially be altering her behavior to breastfeed more or less. There's a huge battle going on there.
And parasitic you could look at it like that as well, where the baby might be influencing the mother's reactions and what her body's doing.
Yeah, and
just when I thought I understood the world.
There was also, I can think of, there's a great review in Nature Immunology, and they were talking about, so imagine, we're talking about 1-to-1 at the moment, like just, mother and one child, but the more children she has, the more chimeric the children are, because the children inherit the cells from the first baby and from the second, and it goes on and on. And so I don't know what more chimeric cells in the body mean. It might be good or bad, but there's certainly like a gradient there. So if we find, say, more chimerism to be related to, say, higher cancer risk, there might be kind of an association between if you're like the first child or the second or the third, and that link there. But yeah.
Wow.
What drives you? Are you driven by, and it can be a combination. Are you driven by like just trying to figure out figure out more about nature, or is it sort of the idea that there could be a utility out there for all of this?
At first I was kind of intrigued by this field due to transmissible cancers. So I started off learning about transmissible cancers in, the Tasmanian devils, the dogs, and recently the bivalves. And then I thought, this is really scary if we find it in humans. And so I thought, any cells being transmitted between humans? And that's where I got to learn about microchimerism. So it seems that these cells are really going from generation to generation, really, since we have, I might have cells in me from my grandparents. Actual cells, or maybe from a child that was that died during birth. So they found that, like, if a mother has a failed pregnancy, some of those cells remain in her body, and so I might have some of those in my body, and I don't know what they're doing. It's all started with me, like, thinking of transmissible cancers and these cells switching all over the place, and kind of infectious disease, really, in a sense, but kind of our own cells, which is even more dangerous because our body finds it hard to kind of get rid of them.
I have this song in my head right now as you're describing this, the one that goes, "Every time you go away, you take a piece of me with you." Sorry about that. I'm not going to be singing much more, people, but
you can get all of his hits, his Christmas album.
Yeah, there's what's interesting to me too now is obviously you're doing this research right now, Dr. Steffi, and you're from Greece, you're in Greece, but you're a postdoc from Arizona State University. Can you describe your path to how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, long path. So I'm actually half Greek, half British. So my mother left England when she was about 20, and she toured Europe, and she ended up in Crete, and she liked it so much that she decided to stay and get involved in tourism. And that's where she met my dad in Crete. And they started mostly involved in tourism, and we have an olive oil factory. And so I mostly grew up in Crete with my twin sister. Conditions in terms of education and the economy aren't great in Greece, but definitely the lifestyle is really healthy, I think, in terms of the Mediterranean diet, and everything's kind of peaceful and not
well,
very
it's snowing
stressful.
where we are right now, so there's that.
It's nice here. It's like close to the beach, and it's like a bit of the geography of Greece is like so we have the European and the African plate colliding. So Greece in general, I mean, and Italy as well, is very mountainous. So we have lots of gorges and lots of earthquakes and volcanoes, and so it's quite turbulent. But anyway, and I started university in Crete. I did biology, lots of molecular biology and biotechnology, but not much evolutionary biology. And so I wanted to learn more about the evolution of multicellularity and how cells cooperate and how different levels of life really cooperate and conflict. So we can start from the very kind of basic level of genes that can be selfish elements, but at some point they kind of came all together to become the genome, and that's called the major transition in individuality. And then we have endosymbiosis, where we have two different things, like the different cells that one engulf the other and have another major transition. Then we have the evolution of multicellularity, which I focused mostly at Oxford. And then there's lots of levels after that, which is like eusociality. So bees, you probably know that they're actually considered a superorganism. So worker bees cannot reproduce independently. Only the queen can. So this is very similar to our own body, where only the germ cells can reproduce, but the somatic cells can't. Mm-hmm. So the whole kind of bee colony is considered a whole organism as itself. But anyway, at Oxford, I worked on the evolution of multicellularity. I did my master's and PhD there in total, it must have been 6 years. As I said, I worked on algae, so freshwater single-celled little things that you can't see them with the naked eye, just only under the microscope. Several different species, and I collected some predators from the pond, and they kind of some squiggly ciliates with like hairy things around them. And some Daphnia. Daphnia are like water fleas. They've got some antennae, and they kind of, I think they use them sometimes to feed in pet shops to feed the fish.
Oh yeah.
Anyway,
we have them around here, definitely.
Anyway, those were my predators, and when I added them to the algae, the different species of algae, the algae would clump all together. And we found that was like a predator defense mechanism. Since the predators couldn't eat the clumps that were very big. But we noticed that we were excited then because we thought, well, we just made a multicellular organism, like this huge clump of cells. It looks like it can function independently and make babies and happily grow. But then a key question, as I said before, is to see how permanent this is. And so when we removed the predators, this colony gradually started to break up into single cells. So in the literature, they call this like a facultative response. So depending on the conditions, cells cooperate, but when conditions change, they kind of break apart. So it's lots of like a cost-benefit thing there, where there's a benefit to clump when there's a predator, but it's again costly because imagine you're in the center of this group of cells. If you're in the center, you don't have much access to nutrients that are outside on the surface, or even access to sunlight, which for algae is very important. It's like food for them. And then, I graduated 2 years ago. And I mean, in parallel, I was doing concerts, so I play the piano as well. So it was quite hard to kind of combine the academic lifestyle with a bit of piano on the side. But I was quite lucky because in in the UK, like at Oxford, there are lots of colleges. So each college has a piano in their chapel, and I usually practice there. And then I wasn't sure what to do next. I applied for several things, especially in Cambridge, because I found a group there that was working on transmissible cancers in the Tasmanian devils and the dogs, and lots of great work there. And I was planning to go there, but then they recommended to me a group in Arizona that there was they recently received a grant lots of grants to kind of build this new center called the Arizona Cancer and Evolution Center. And the more I read about it, I realized that it was kind of just right for me, because it combined what I knew from evolutionary biology and also cancer, which I wanted to kind of look at cancer and transmissible cancers. So we formed a collaboration with the group in Cambridge that works on transmissible cancers, but I'm based in Arizona. And when I say based, I mean, at the moment so I started there in Arizona about 2 years ago, and we've mostly been working on the chimerism project, as I said, like looking at chimerism across species and cancer across species. And I'll say a bit more about some other projects as well. So yes, yeah.
Now you mentioned you're the piano. You're a pianist.
Yeah.
How does that influence your science, if it does, and science influence your art? Is there some infusion between those two fields?
That's difficult. I mean, from a very early stage, like since high school, me and my sister, we were kind of in the news, kind of the stars of piano and winning international competitions, and so the road was kind of certain that we were going to become academics in music professors, and kind of concert hall pianists. And so we had this kind of concept in us, or this idea that everything was all set. And we didn't want to leave that, really, because we really enjoyed playing the piano. And so when we were about to decide whether to go to England to study music, or for me to study biology in Crete, it was a really hard decision, really, because we loved both playing the piano and science. But there were some minor things, really, that we were accepted at King's College London to study music there, but the program really there wasn't really quite the fit for us. We preferred performing music rather than and not as much reading like historical aspects of music. And there were some minor things that at the end we decided to do science in Crete, like at the University of Crete. And but we continued doing private lessons, music private lessons, and every 2 weeks we would go to Athens with the ship and have private lessons there. And the same happened when I went to Oxford and did my master's and PhD. Every 2 weeks, I would go to London to a professor, a head of a professor there at the Royal Academy of Music, and we would have private lessons with him. And that kind of kept us going with music. But I haven't really answered your question yet. How do these join up? So during all that time, we've been thinking of how to join up science and music. And so when I went to Oxford and my sister started her studies at Imperial, there were several conferences where we saw certain opportunities. So the first thing, kind of major thing or major or minor, to kind of join up these two things was to have, we had a silent nature documentary in the background. So either a David Attenborough documentary or other the animals on the background just wandering about and doing what they do. And we were playing live classical music. So there was a concert hall, we had the piano, and we had found music that matches the background. And we would have like a kind of like a film, but kind of live. And at the same time, like we would have gaps where we would talk about our science at the same time. And there are other opportunities as well. I mean, sometimes I compose music, but I make themes or lyrics that are science related. So I talk about the DNA. It's very early stages, but in our group in Arizona, there's like some people that are dedicated to combining the science and the arts, and there's a very strong outreach team. And I've been involved in that quite a bit, and we're trying to kind of show these things to new students that come in the lab and promote these things in like museums and any outreach events that we do. So it's constantly creative, but there's no.
Do you think it's entwined? Like certainly many universities that I've experienced, when there's a music department and the sciences, they are separated by roads or blocks or miles, depending on the size of the university. Like, it's this side of the street, that side of the street kind of thing.
Different colleges in Oxford, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So do you think that that is a problem, like that separation?
Yeah, I've seen some moves towards the better, or like combining these things. I mean, I don't know if it's for the better or worse. I mean, it's a trial. Because in some universities, it's, I suppose, the first thing that comes to mind is like there was an initiative from some collaborators in Arizona where in our department, which is mostly science-based, they tried to bring some art in the department. So have essentially paintings. Maybe some were science related, but there was some conflict there because some scientists found this quite disturbing. So it's difficult sometimes. I mean, some people like to be, I don't know, completely focused and just keep the things separate, or it depends on like each person or each culture, how they've grown up.
Sure.
It's definitely, I mean, a great thing to explore how they could be combined. I mean, also my mother and, I mean, my sister and I, my mother especially, she started an arts and science festival a few years ago in Crete. And that's exactly the principle, kind of trying to bring science and the arts together. And so... Almost
like a disciplinary chimera.
I know.
Exactly.
I was like totally thinking,
Yeah, thinking about chimeras, I often think, well, maybe I'm a kind of science and arts chimera. But, so...
Well, you would imagine that almost everybody is, but sort of the logistics of education or the structure, even something as simple as like the course catalog, that has to have chapters and it's broken apart. And you wonder, like even high school students or even in primary schedules, things like that, it's like, okay, science time, art time, and there's that separation just for scheduling, right?
Yeah.
But does that teach kids that
these are isolated?
Yeah.
That people are isolated like that and their interests are. And I think one of the goals of this series of our podcast with Scientists Out Loud is that actually it's not a goal. It came out of talking to scientists like you, Dr. Steffi, is that many people have gone through a path where it wasn't science right away, or it was entwined with other things, and that variety has brought them to there.
I mean, human beings are just a combination of so many things. I mean, they might be focused as their career goes into one thing, I don't know, science or arts or football, I don't know. But they certainly appreciate like going to a film festival, or they appreciate kind of spending time drawing, or I've seen so many people now with the lockdown just explore so many different things, or cooking, I don't know. But what I wanted to, as you were talking, I remembered something that happened in my music school. So in Greece, I mean, the majority of schools are public schools. There's some private schools, but there are also some public arts or music schools. So I went to music school, and I remember there's like the atmosphere there is like you have a maths lesson, and you can hear a flute lesson happening in the next door. So you can hear it's like, I mean, and sometimes it was a bit, you could lose your focus, but it was just like typical of like everything's so joined together. We're talking about maths, but this might be a line, but so fluid mechanics. It's so like wavy and
Well, you get those flutes to sync up with whatever graphing is taking place. That would be data sonification is always a thing that I love. That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Steffi, thank you so much for your time. It was truly eye-opening for us to think about a new field that's emerging, and maybe some of our listeners might even start looking into that. And when we think we have learned everything, and I don't mean that, of course, but there's always new avenues that we can explore. And thank you for talking to us about that.
Thank you. It was nice to talk to you too.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Lab Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about some of the things discussed in this episode or previous episodes, you can find show notes at our website, laboutloud.com. If you have a guest idea or a future topic that you'd like to see on Lab Out Loud, go to our contact page and send us a message. Also, you can subscribe to Lab Out Loud on your favorite podcasting app, such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you like to find podcasts. While you're there, leave us a review and rating. Your input helps others find our show. Thanks again for listening.